بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everybody. I'd like to start by thanking the Cambridge Muslim College staff and the students for both inviting me to speak today and for their very gracious hosting of this conference and of the guest speakers. We're really being well looked after. So, my presentation, Victorian Muslim Dissenters. I'm going to look at Abdullah Quilliam and Mohammed Marmaduke Pickthall. Before the advent of religious rejection, witnessed by a particularly aggressive, if not arrogant, secular atheism, religious dissent largely grappled with theology and dogma, rather than an anti-essentialist and narcissistic postmodern search for the self. Exponents of aggressive atheism, Hitchens, Dawkins, Grayling, etc., rather lazily prefer to go straight to jail rather than hedging their bets on a kind of Pascal's wager, or better still, exploring alternative and more plausible theologies. Conversely, religious dissent, although now unusually associated usually associated with British Christians who separated from the Church of England from the 16th to the 18th centuries because of their resented state interference in religious matters, actually begins in Britain long before 6th century Roman imposition of Catholic Christianity. Pelagius, circa 360 to 418, was a British-born ascetic moralist, said by some to be the father of Celtic Christianity, well before St. Columba established his Ionian monastic community in around 563. Pelagius did not reach the hagiographic heights of St. Columba, but his theological services to Christianity had both profound and lasting impacts. His theological concept of divine grace, in direct opposition to Augustine of Hippo's ideas of divine predestination, original sin, and divine aid in the performing of good works, led him to be declared a heretic, whose interpretation of free will became known eponymously as Pelagianism. After he was banished from Jerusalem for his dissenting beliefs, Pelagius is said to have eventually died in obscurity in Egypt, a place later familiar to both Quilliam and Pickthall. Quilliam was born a religious dissenter, whereas Pickthall eventually became one. Both were proficient Arabists, one-time Freemason brethren, English Muslim scholars, and working imams, Quilliam at Liverpool, Pickthall at Woking, and both were regarded with some suspicion by the British intelligence services. Quilliam was born into a respectable middle-class, non-conformist Wesleyan Methodist family and had strong ancestral links to the Isle of Man dating back over 300 years. His professional life seems distinctly shaped by his religious convictions and social relations. Jamie Gillam has asserted that Quilliam was, quote, living and working as a poor man's lawyer in Liverpool, and that his membership of the Liverpool Alliance Masonic Lodge was largely driven by, quote, the Masonic ideals of non-sectarian fraternity, faith, and charity that especially appealed to Quilliam. Added to Quilliam's firmly established beliefs regarding equality and philanthropy was his lifelong commitment to the temperance movement, which Quilliam joined at the tender age of 7. By the age of 14, Quilliam was secretary of the Russell Street Temperance Society in Liverpool and was already an accomplished public orator. He continued to preach the virtues of sobriety throughout his life. After his conversion to Islam, he used his connections in the temperance movement to proselytize through numerous lectures on how Muslim societies were absent of the social evils associated with alcohol abuse. In the developing non-conformist Christianity of the late Victorian era, Gertrude Himmelfarb asserts that a clear distinction can be made, quote, as evangelicalism was the primary bearer of those Victorian values among the middle classes, so Methodism was among the working classes. Perhaps the downside of nonconformism was, at least in its nascent stages, that it merely reinforced industrial capitalism's rigid classism. As T.B. Bottomore ironically opines, quote, it produced also the snobbery of the middle classes, the religion of inequality, as Matthew Arnold called it, which maintained fine but strict social distinctions at which foreign observers marveled. For Quilliam, his dissatisfaction with the theological disputes and moral contradictions in late Victorian society created a deep disillusionment that, by his open admission, was only resolved by his discovery and acceptance of Islam. Nevertheless, the staunch liberalism associated with the Methodist Church in Liverpool had manifested itself in their political resistance to the city's slave trade. As Jeeves asserts, quote, in this period of his life, Quilliam could be marked out as a liberal in a number of other significant ways. These particular political convictions included his passionate support against capital punishment, outspoken views on anti-slavery and the treatment of American Negroes, and his notable campaigning for the rights of the working class as leader of various trade unions of the city of Liverpool. Quilliam was the legal representative of a number of trade unions, and from 1897 until 1908, he remained the elected president of the 8,000-strong Mersey Railway Quay and Carters Union. It is fair to assume that Liverpool's burgeoning trade union movement, inspired by strong socialist values of equity and workers' rights, was collectively expressing a clear vote of confidence in Quilliam's legal abilities and political convictions in his continued appointment as president of their union, an important and well-subscribed labour organisation. Added to this was his reputation as the poor man's solicitor, because, in the words of his English contemporary, Dr. Khalid Sheldrake, Quilliam regularly, quote, fought cases for men who were penniless and charged no fee. Both Jeeves and Gillam confirmed that the overwhelming majority of Quilliam's convert Muslim community were working-class people from Liverpool, and Gillam observes that, quote, because Quilliam deliberately sought to attract local working-class folk, many of the converts were indeed, as the Scottish convert John Yahya Nasser Parkinson noticed, working men and women. Jeeves further asserts that, quote, Quilliam's converts came from all walks of life. In this, the Liverpool community differed from Woking, as the latter was formed predominantly of upper-class men and women and their South Asian equivalents. Gillam's analysis of the occupations of members of the Liverpool Muslim Institute reveals that, quote, the majority of the 60 British Muslims whose occupation is known were of working-class origin, and that, quote, a minority were from the old middle classes. Few were, as Quilliam claimed, well-educated and widely travelled. In fact, the majority working-class socio-demographic of Quilliam's community was derided by Christian missionaries who visited the Muslim Institute as, quote, very ordinary people, drawn generally speaking from the lower ranks of life. persons as a whole, neither of education nor position. It was perhaps this spiritual arrogance from the church clergy that drew Quilliam as a Muslim nearer to those less well positioned socially than himself. The Medina Home for Children, originally established at 68 Shield Road in Liverpool, was officially registered with the local authorities in 1896. This project saw the Muslim community providing an orphanage for the homeless children, often born out of wedlock or abandoned by their impoverished parents. The Medina Home housed, clothed, fed, and educated orphans of Liverpool, providing a great civic and social service to the city. Exactly how many children passed through the orphanage is not known, but Quilliam and his co-religionists were not completely altruistic in their philanthropic efforts, as, quote, fondlings who were raised in the orphanage were brought up as Muslims, and mothers who gave up their infants to the orphanage were required to sign a special clause that stated the children would be raised as Muslims. As Quilliam's missionary activities began to draw more converts to the faith, his institute attracted both local and national antagonism. Mashaq Ali attributes this condemnation largely to Quilliam's open criticism of the church missionary activities in Muslim countries. Quilliam was also seen as anti-British as a result of his infamous fatwa to the Egyptian soldiers in 1896, which openly criticised British colonial policy in Sudan and urged Muslim soldiers in the British Army to refrain from taking arms against Muslims in the Sudan. In adopting this pro-Ottoman stance, Quilliam allied himself with other Muslim converts, including Pickthall and Lady Evelyn Zainab Cobbold. Turcophile English Muslims like Quilliam and Pickthall were subjected to close scrutiny and surveillance by the British intelligence services, and in contemporary terms would be described, perhaps, as political Islamists. Intelligence services were increasingly afraid of the political influence of revolutionary socialism or Bolshevism from Russia, taking root amongst what they considered to be subversive groups such as the pro-Ottoman Turcophiles. Quilliam observes that, quote, Pickthall and his associates, which included Quilliam, then living under the pseudonym Professor Lyon, were taken seriously. Pickthall was no Bolshevik, but a glance at the Islamic Information Bureau membership and a perusal of the Muslim Outlook, the Bureau's pro-Ottoman bulletin, led the India office to suspect that the group was, quote, to some extent, anti-British. The political affiliation of Quilliam and Pickthall ran contrary to many of their English co-religionists, with Lord Headley and his British Muslim Society members preferring to remain distinctly apolitical, instead presenting themselves as loyal and faithful British Muslim subjects. At a time when the British Empire claimed to have more Muslim subjects than Christians, Quilliam bravely drew a line in the sand with regards to what he believed represented fidelity of faith and allegiances in the British imperial context, stating, quote, if Great Britain desires to realise and to utilise the mighty power and to preserve the brilliant loyalty of its Islamic subjects, the first steps towards attainment of that object are a good understanding and a firm friendship with the Caliph of the Faithful, His Glorious and Imperial Majesty, Ghazi Abdul Hamid Khan Sultan, may Allah long preserve him, and official discontinuing, very Victorian, of the scurrilous attacks upon Islam and Muslim rulers, which from time to time appear in the British press. That's from the Crescent of 1902. Quilliam consistently claimed to be a loyal and faithful Muslim subject, despite his stark criticism of foreign policy towards the Balkans crisis, Sudan military expedition, and hostilities to the Ottomans. But his forthright, outspoken, and often controversial views caused many to charge Quilliam of treason. He was later to remark, quote, "Only my insignificance saved me from being prosecuted for high treason." That's from the Islamic World in 1896. Gillam asserts Quilliam's political views were no more than a minor irritation for local politicians, and that it was more likely that, quote, his general activities as Sheikh al-Islam that both subjected him to official scrutiny and made his life in Britain difficult, eventually forcing his exile to Turkey in 1908. In late Victorian society, the impact of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of empire, detraditionalization of religion, and the focus on rationalism, science, and technology transformed Britain into a leading capitalist economy that divided the population into clearly defined socio-economic classes, upper, middle, and working. Quilliam, as an educated and comfortable middle-class religious leader and lawyer, would have been well aware of the spiritual and political consequences of an increasingly divided society. Yet, the social philosophies associated with the various strands of Wesleyanism, quote, extended beyond respectful liberalism, in some variants at least, to radicalism and militancy, even perhaps to active subversion. That's a quote from Westergaard and Ressler. Quilliam's organised religio-political activities were certainly viewed in this way by British intelligence. A.H. Hasley asserts in Industrial Britain, nonconformists were not only the leaders of religiosity, but also of radicalism, which schooled more than one generation of radicals, claiming that capitalism was not just unchristian, but actually anti-Christian. Again, Quilliam appears to have subscribed to this view, as did his appointed deputy imam of the Liverpool Mosque, Maulana Mohammed Barakatullah, who, along with the pan-Islamist Moshir Hussein Kidwahi, were particularly influenced by Bolshevik ideas and advocated revolutionary socialism as being entirely compatible with the achievement of Muslim anti-colonial aims. There is little evidence to suggest that Quilliam was opposed to the ideas of socialism. In 1895, for example, the Institute Young Man's Debating Society hosted an evening discussing the merits of socialism, and that was reported in the Crescent in 1895. As a modern, rational, scientific, religious intellectual, Quilliam was certainly a man of his time. His personal library, said to have housed over 2,000 books, is evidence of his acute, open, and inquiring spirit. Quilliam, the modernist, would have kept abreast of all new technological, philosophical, and political trends, and would have engaged with modern developments in the spirit of objective inquiry and self-advancement. The scientist in Quilliam was willing to engage in the empirical evidences of archaeology, geology, his specialist subject, and biological evolutionism as espoused by Charles Darwin. As a religious intellectual, Quilliam emerged as the first bona fide Sheikh al-Islam of Britain. This achievement should not be undermined as merely honorific. His vast bibliography on matters of religion alone is as yet to be surpassed by any British Muslim scholar. But Quilliam was not just a man of literary and oratory eloquence. He was a missionary activist, egalitarian, philanthropist, reformist, socialist, and political agitator, much to the annoyance of the British imperial establishment. Whilst Quilliam's ultimate objective of establishing a British Islam, quote, complete with indigenous Muslims, was never fully realized, his legacy remains with us until today, the model for anyone wishing to emulate it, to establish a micro-Muslim community complete with institutions and infrastructures, is an accessible blueprint preserved in his collected writings, journals and magazines, and luckily in the very building, the Liverpool Muslim Institute, now the Abdullah Quilliam Heritage Centre at Brougham Terrace, where he undertook his ambitious endeavours. His continued commitment to the burgeoning working class trades union movement, both as a leading member representative and legal advisor, coupled with his reputation as the poor man's lawyer, clearly demonstrate his empathetic proximity to the working class struggle. Added to this are his associations with pro-Ottoman activities, which raised suspicions with the British intelligence services that he might be a, quote, Bolshevik, but he was definitely anti-British. His close association with Barakatullah, a self-proclaimed revolutionary socialist who declared it to be compatible with Muslim aims to rid India of British imperialism, and his unrelenting religious stand against British imperialism in Sudan, opposition of the British to the Ottomans, resulting in controversial fatwa that were certainly instrumental in his exile in 1908. Moving on to Pickthall. Pickthall's journey to Islam was less to do with theological contentions within his original Protestant Christian faith, and more to do with the rise of anti-Ottomanism, asserted British imperialism, and the future of Europe and the Islamic world. His novels bear much of the ethnographer about them, rich and informed in their intimate details of everyday, ordinary life in early 20th century Arabia. Peter Clarke, Pickthall's most detailed biographer, has said that what was unique about him was his empathetic and well-informed writing, coupled with his Muslim faith, which produced a, quote, mature and accomplished author writing the English Islamic novel. Whilst both Pickthall's father and grandfather were Anglican vicars, and a number of his stepsisters were nuns, he became increasingly disaffected with church life and attitudes. Clarke again asserts Pickthall regarded church missionaries as, quote, misguided menaces who, with spiritual arrogance and political ineptitude, were alienating the Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire and undermining the empire itself. In many ways, Pickthall's life appeared to be conveniently mapped out through a vocation within church ministry. Fortuitously, it was to be his personal family connections in the church that provided him the opportunity to travel to the Middle East in the first instance. In Egypt, Pickthall developed a paradoxical admiration for British imperial rule, which he found distinctly manifest in Cromer, who had been Consul General for 20 years. Pickthall believed that the British presence in Egypt had brought both order and tolerance to the country, two important facets he felt were sadly lacking elsewhere in the Middle East. His views ran contrary to the increasing nationalist sentiments of the Egyptian people, as did his conviction that the Ottoman Empire be more closely associated with British rule as a means of both reducing the power of the Egyptian Khedive and enamoring ordinary Egyptians towards their British colonial occupiers. But as events in the Ottoman provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina witnessed Austria's annexation shortly after the Young Turk Revolution in Turkey, Pickthall became ever more empathetic towards the rapidly westernizing Ottoman Empire and increasingly more frustrated at Britain and Europe's betrayal of the 1878 Treaty of Berlin. In 1913, he wrote With the Turk in Wartime, in which he furiously berated the British press and public for its blind fanaticism, responding to the call of a crusade against the Turk, at which he retorted, the solidarity of Christendom against a Muslim power was reckoned to be a fine thing by many people, but it broke the heart of an Englishman who loved the East. His informed articulations on political affairs in Ottoman Turkey and the Middle East found a regular home in the newly published weekly, The New Age, intended to be politically radical and ideologically socialist. Pickthall contributed a number of articles covering events in Egypt, Palestine, Turkey, and the Balkans. His dissenting voice and pro-Ottoman discourse was continuously published throughout the First World War, displaying an astonishing tolerance by the British government, who withheld any censorship of such then contentious sentiments. Whilst the groundwork for the First World War was being prepared in Britain and Europe, Pickthall's own political convictions became further polarised by the rise of an anti-Muslim propaganda, primarily legitimised by the Church, demonising the Ottoman Empire as satanic for its assumed suppression of Eastern European Christian Dhimma within its domains. In response to this stark Islamophobia, the New Age press printed a series of articles by Pickthall, collectively titled The Black Crusade, in which he spelt out the case for increased British-Ottoman alliances. His main arguments centred on the Turks' continued compliance with the Treaty of Berlin, despite Austria's colonisation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Italy's invasion of Tripoli, and the Balkan Christian states invading European Turkey. He also argued that the progressive revolution of the Young Turk movement towards the establishment of a modern secular nation-state based on a European model was a clear indication that Turkey did not represent a threat to Britain or Europe, to which it aspired. In an effort to develop a greater informed view of the impending hostilities against the Turks, in 1912, Pickthall decided to visit Turkey on a fact-finding mission. His outright support of Britain's opposing imperial power, the Ottomans, manifested itself in a particularly vitriolic lambast of Armenian Dhimma in the Turkish provinces. Whilst Pickthall fully expected Britain to lend its support to the Ottoman reformers, he was somewhat aghast when Britain's complicit silence when Austria invaded Turkey's Eastern European provinces. When a counter-coup sought to re-establish the deposed Sultan Hamid Thani in April 1909, Armenian minorities in Adana revolted against Ottoman power, which was heavily suppressed by the Turks and virulently opposed by British politicians. Pickthall was adamant that Ottoman religious minorities were privileged in comparison with other ordinary Muslim subjects, believing that that European powers were encouraging Armenians to revolt as a means of weakening the might of the Ottomans. He noted that Europeans were never in danger from the Turks, but rather, quote, rumours current in the West are due to the reports of Armenians, Greeks, and other Levantines. In 1914, Pickthall wrote, "A fine race is being hounded to its death by Europe because it is too proud to plead and cannot beg." For Pickthall, it appears that a post-reformist reparticularised Turkey was the only way forward for the Ummah. In a letter to his wife, written during the visit to Turkey, he stated, "Turkey is the present head of a progressive movement extending throughout Asia and North Africa. She is also the one hope for the Islamic world." Like the reformist ulama, Pickthall saw no conflict between modernisation and Islam, believing instead that Turks should embrace their Islamic heritage rather than sheepishly imitate other their European counterparts. Pickthall then associated himself with a number of organisations that were set up to support pro-Ottoman political relations between Britain and the Turks. All of them were monitored by the British intelligence services, especially the Anglo-Ottoman Society, whose head, Duse Muhammad Ali, was charged, although not convicted, of collecting money for the Ottoman Arabs in Libya to fight the Italian invaders. So, to bring things to a close, as time is against us, after the war in 1919, Pickthall was installed as Imam of the Woking Mosque and as editor of the Islamic Review, and lent his efforts to other leading Muslims who were arguing for the continuation of the Ottoman Empire, the destruction of which they believed would not only be in the interests of British imperial rule and would add further troubles in Asia and, more importantly, in British India. His pan-Islamist writings for the newly published pro-Turkish bulletin, Muslim Outlook, and his employment with the London-based Islamic Information Bureau, which was supported by two prominent Indian Muslims, Moshir Hossain Kidwahi and Haji Muhammad Hisham Isfahani, were equated with the Bolshevik People's Russian Information Bureau. And when added to Pickthall's other associations, the Anglo-Ottoman Society, the League of Justice for Asia and Africa, the Islamic Society, etc., these placed him high on the list of anti-British undesirables by British intelligence. Pickthall and his alleged co-conspirators were collectively termed the Woking Mosque Gang in several internal intelligence communications. Conversely, Scotland Yard officers who had been monitoring Pickthall's activity for a while asserted that, unlike his other Bolshevik agitators, in all probability, at heart, he is a loyal British subject. What was not understood by many regarding Pickthall's pessimistic vision of a post-Ottoman Middle East and a post-colonial India, a chaotic, divided, and hostile geo-religious polity, seems to be quite accurate in current times. Pickthall clearly believed that religion, not just his own professed conversion to Islam, but all the universal faiths, could offer political and spiritual solutions to the global crises he witnessed evolving around him. Like Quilliam, his attempt to forge a British Islam through a manifest English Muslimness were realized for a short period before the First World War, but global politics drew a veil over its burgeoning presence. He sought solace through migration to India, a place where he consolidated his religious and political ideologies through a deeply informed articulation of scholarly writings, culminating in his English translation of the Quran, by far his greatest achievement and lasting legacy. Thank you.